I'd first like to thank everyone for having me and for this platform to speak. Well, where to begin? Because there are so many parallels, so many connected narratives which run between what we know as the Black Lives Matter movement, but also between that and the greater experience of South African history. Because as was earlier pointed out with reference to the words of Biko, we are so within this culture of a struggle between police brutality and blackness. It is ingrained within our history. And we've seen it come about again and again where there are youth uprisings, much like this Black Lives Matter movement is within South African context, which speak directly to it because they are faced with police force. So when it comes to specifically localizing, I would like to speak to my experience, firstly being a Black South African who lived in America, but also being a Black South African activist who's tried to navigate through this movement. So my experience moving from South Africa to America was not what I expected. I was warned that there was, of course, a difference living in a Black majority versus a Black minority country. And with that came, of course, tokenization and other subtle, but also sometimes overt, very racist experiences. So much so that my old high school now has an entire Instagram page dedicated to firstly addressing, acknowledging, but also reforming the school's policies and such when it comes to racism. Now, when I look at the discussion that was happening with my school there now, and I think back to the Pretoria Girls protests, which happened something close to, I think, 3 years ago, where a brave young woman, Zuleka, stood up and spoke to the racist hair policies, which is something that is a conversation that has been reignited here. So I think it's really interesting seeing how many ways we are connected in the conversations we have. Then moving forward, I also studied in the US. And during that time, I found myself coming into contact with what I understood to be an institutional level of racism. And what I mean specifically about this is I studied in one of the Claremont colleges, and one of the historic pieces of research that occurred in the Claremont colleges was a eugenics program. And anyone that is familiar with what eugenics is knows that it is about white supremacy. It is literally the racialization of academic institution and biology against Black people. So it is an anti-Black practice. And that is something that, of course, we saw very commonly practiced in South Africa during the time of the apartheid regime, but even before that. So the unfortunate fact is that for many Black people, like myself, when you are conscious of it, you can see it everywhere, and it is so rampant that it sometimes becomes a bit difficult to even mobilize. And what I mean by that is when the protests started occurring in Johannesburg, we knew exactly what we were there for, but at the same time, we knew the very different circumstances we stood at, being in a Black majority country, because in a lot of senses, yes, the policymakers are Black, but as identified by a World Health Organization and a World Bank study in 2010, the locus and the legacy of apartheid, of this anti-Blackness, of this entire systemic and institutional levels of racism are still very much apparent in the form of townships and informal settlements. And what that means specifically is, yes, we are aware that Black people are now the policymakers, but we can't pretend as though townships and informal settlements no longer exist. In fact, during a time of COVID, we've seen an increase in the amount of food packages and the damage, the true damage that historical institutional racism has done to food security in a lot of Black communities locally, because we understood that the creation of townships is part of the apartheid geospatial legacy, which pretty much removed Black people, of course, as we know, from their land, but also specifically placed them in spaces that were not accommodating for life, that were not arable, that were not serviced by any level of government. So through all of this, we understand that when we say Black Lives Matter, especially all Black Lives Matter in South Africa, we are fighting so many battles that, yes, the government is fighting and is trying to navigate, but they're also trying to not be what early French philosophers would call a petite bourgeoisie, who are essentially just another colonial tool who further neo-colonial practices.